I need you to look at this photograph. Really look at it. 7 children standing in a perfect line, their parents positioned at the ends like bookends. Everyone's wearing brand new clothes, the kind of clothes a tobacco farmer's family would never wear on an ordinary day. The girls have matching dresses with white collars. The boys are buttoned up in fresh shirts. The mother's wearing her Sunday best, and the father, Charlie Lawson, stands there in a new suit that probably cost him a week's wages. They're all staring at the camera with that stiff, uncomfortable expression people had in the 1920s. But there's something else in their eyes, something I can't quite name. This photo was taken in late December 1929, just outside Germanton, North Carolina. Within days, 6 of these children would be dead. The mother would be dead, and Charlie Lawson, the man who'd insisted on this photograph, would paint the snow red with his family's blood on Christmas Day. I've spent years researching American family murders. I've read case files that made my hands shake. I've walked through houses where unthinkable things happened. I've interviewed descendants of victims, pored over autopsy reports, and stood in places where evil left its permanent mark. But nothing, and I mean nothing, has haunted me like the Lawson Family Massacre. Maybe it's because it happened on Christmas, a day we associate with joy and togetherness and the innocence of childhood wonder. Maybe it's because of how methodically Charlie prepared for it, buying those new clothes, arranging that photo session, setting everything in motion like he was planning a celebration instead of an execution. Or maybe it's because we still don't know why. We have theories, whispers, accusations that float through the decades like ghosts that refuse to rest. But the truth died with Charlie in those North Carolina woods, and all we're left with are questions that echo through 95 years of deafening silence. The Lawson family wasn't wealthy. They weren't famous. They weren't the kind of people who make headlines. They were tobacco farmers trying to survive in rural North Carolina during the hardest economic times America had ever seen. Charlie and Fannie had built a life together from nothing, raised their children in a modest farmhouse, worked the land with calloused hands and bent backs. By all accounts, they were an ordinary family. Sure, Charlie had a temper most men did back then, when authority was rarely questioned and discipline was harsh. Sure, money was tight for everyone in 1929, with the stock market crash reverberating through every corner of American society. But nothing suggested that on Christmas morning, Charlie would take a shotgun and a wooden club and systematically murder his wife and 6 of his children before turning the gun on himself in the woods behind the farmhouse. I'm going to tell you their story, not the sanitized version you might find in a dusty history book that glosses over the horror, not the ghost story version that focuses on haunted houses and paranormal activity while ignoring the real human tragedy. I'm going to tell you what really happened in that farmhouse on Christmas Day, 1929. I'm going to walk you through Charlie's last days, his strange behavior that his neighbors whispered about, the bloody aftermath that traumatized an entire community, and the questions that still keep researchers like me awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what could drive a father to such unthinkable violence. I'm going to introduce you to the victims not as names on a crumbling tombstone, but as real people with personalities and dreams and futures that were stolen in the span of 30 minutes. Because here's what I've learned after years of studying this case. After traveling to North Carolina multiple times, after reading every document I could find, the Lawson Massacre wasn't just a tragedy. It was a mystery wrapped in a nightmare, sealed with blood, and buried under decades of Southern silence and shame. And that photograph, that damned photograph of the family in their new clothes, taken just days before the massacre, might be the only clue Charlie left us. So let me take you back to North Carolina, to the winter of 1929, to a farmhouse that would become a slaughterhouse, and to a father who became a monster. This is the story of the Lawson Family Christmas Massacre. Charlie Lawson woke up on December 22, 1929, with murder on his mind. I don't know this for certain. There's no diary, no confession, no note explaining his thoughts. But I believe it in my bones, based on everything that happened in the days leading up to Christmas. Something had shifted in him during those final weeks of December. Some internal mechanism had clicked into its final position, and the man who'd been Charlie Lawson's husband, father, farmer, neighbor, was transforming into something else entirely. He told Fannie to get the children ready early that Sunday morning. They were going into town. They were going to Winston-Salem, the nearest city big enough to have a professional photography studio. They were going to get their photograph taken, all of them together, as a family. Fannie must have been surprised. Professional photographs cost real money, money they didn't have, especially with Christmas just 3 days away and bills piling up like the tobacco leaves in their barn. But Charlie insisted with a forcefulness that Fannie recognized as non-negotiable. He'd already bought new clothes for everyone, spending a sum that should have gone toward keeping the farm running through the winter. New dresses for the girls, Marie, Carrie, and little Maybell. Nice pressed shirts for the boys, Arthur, James, and Raymond. A beautiful outfit for Fannie that made her look like she was going to a wedding, and a proper suit for himself, the kind city men wore, with pressed trousers and a jacket that made him look like someone important. When Fannie asked why they needed professional photographs, why they needed new clothes, why they were spending money they couldn't spare, Charlie just said it was important, that they needed to do this, that he wanted a record of the family all together. His tone brooked no argument, and Fannie, like most wives in 1929, knew better than to push when her husband's jaw sat in that particular way. The family loaded into Charlie's truck and made the journey to Winston-Salem. The younger children were excited a trip to the city was a rare treat, an adventure beyond the limited horizons of farm life. Marie, at 17, helped her mother wrangle the little ones. Arthur, 16 and nearly a man, sat up front with his father, watching the countryside roll past. James, Carrie, Maybell, and little Raymond bounced in the back, their breath-making clouds in the cold December air. Baby Mary Lou, just 4 months old, slept in Fannie's arms, wrapped in blankets against the chill. They must have looked like any farm family heading to town, perhaps to do Christmas shopping or visit relatives. Nobody looking at them would have suspected that this was a family on the edge of annihilation, that the man driving the truck had already decided their fates. The photography session was conducted at a studio in Winston-Salem. I've spent hours trying to track down information about the photographer, but his name is lost to history. What we have are the photographs themselves, and they chill me every single time I look at them. There are several shots taken that day, different arrangements, different groupings, different poses. In the main photograph, the one that would become infamous, the entire family stands in a line, arranged by height. Charlie stands at one end, solid and unsmiling in his new suit. Fannie stands at the other end, holding baby Mary Lou, her expression neutral and composed. Between them, the 7 children are arranged like stairs, Arthur tall and serious, then Marie with her dark hair and solemn eyes, then Carrie looking uncomfortable in her new dress, then the younger boys, then little Maybell at 7 years old, trying to stand still for the camera. None of them are smiling. Nobody smiled in photographs back then. Of course, the long exposure times required stillness. And besides, formal portraits were serious business, not occasions for frivolity. But there's something beyond that formality in this image. There's a tension that I can feel across 95 years of distance. The children look stiff, yes, but also uncertain, like they don't quite understand why they're here or what this means. Marie has her hand on Carrie's shoulder, a protective gesture that breaks my heart every time I notice it. Arthur stands straight as a soldier, but his eyes have a questioning quality, like he's trying to understand what his father is thinking. The younger children, James at 4, Raymond at 2, look confused and slightly bored the way small children do when forced to stand still for adult purposes they can't comprehend. And Charlie stands there looking at the camera with an expression I can only describe as empty. His face is blank, his eyes are distant, and there's something profoundly wrong in his bearing that you can see even through the grainy black and white image. Charlie paid the photographer a significant sum, several dollars that represented days of hard work, and took his family home. The drive back to Germanton was quiet. Charlie didn't speak much, and the children, sensing their father's mood, kept their chatter subdued. When they arrived back at the farmhouse, as the winter sun was setting, Charlie told everyone to keep their new clothes clean and nice. They were Christmas clothes now, special clothes, and he didn't want them ruined by farm work or play. The children changed back into their everyday wear-patched trousers for the boys, worn dresses for the girls, and the new outfits were hung carefully in the small closets and on hooks around the house. Charlie spent the evening sitting by the fire, smoking his pipe, staring into the flames. Fannie asked him several times if he was feeling well, if something was troubling him. He told her he was fine, just tired from the trip to Winston-Salem. Over the next couple of days, Monday, the 23rd, and Tuesday, the 24th, Charlie continued acting strangely. Neighbors who saw him commented later to investigators that he seemed preoccupied, distant, like his mind was somewhere far away from Germanton and the approaching Christmas holiday. He was irritable with the children, snapping at them for minor infractions that he'd normally overlook. When James accidentally knocked over a bucket of water, Charlie yelled at the 4-year-old with a fury that seemed disproportionate to the small accident. When Carrie asked about Christmas dinner, about whether they'd have turkey or chicken, Charlie told her harshly to stop pestering him with foolish questions. Fannie noticed the change in her husband's behavior and grew worried. She confided in a neighbor that Charlie hadn't been himself lately, that something was weighing on him, that she feared he might be getting sick or dealing with money trouble she didn't know about. On Christmas Eve, Charlie's behavior became almost manic. He insisted on going through all the traditional Christmas preparations with an intensity that struck Fannie as strange. He helped her in the kitchen, preparing food for the next day's Christmas dinner. He played with the younger children, getting down on the floor with James and Raymond, building things with wooden blocks, tickling them until they shrieked with laughter. He checked on the tobacco stored in the barn, examining the dried leaves with the same attention he always gave to their cash crop. He chopped extra firewood, stacking it neatly by the back door. He was in constant motion, as if afraid that stopping would mean confronting something terrible. But his eyes remained somewhere else. Arthur, the oldest son, later told investigators that his father seemed like he wasn't really there on Christmas Eve, that he'd look at you but wouldn't actually see you, that it was like talking to a shadow or a ghost of the man they'd known their whole lives. That night, Christmas Eve, the family went to bed in the small farmhouse they lived in for years. The children were excited for Christmas morning, for whatever small gifts might appear, for the special dinner their mother would cook. Fannie lay beside Charlie in their bed, listening to his breathing, sensing the tension in his body, even as he pretended to sleep. She almost asked him again what was wrong, what was troubling him so deeply. But she was tired, and the morning would come early with excited children waking before dawn, and so she let the moment pass. If she'd known what the next day would bring, would she have said something different? Would she have shaken Charlie awake and demanded answers? Would it have mattered? These are the questions I torture myself with when I think about this case. The what-ifs that haunt every tragedy. Christmas morning, December 25, 1929, dawned cold and clear over Germanton, North Carolina. The sky was that pale winter blue that promises a beautiful day. A light frost covered the ground, making the world sparkle in the early morning sun. Inside the Lawson farmhouse, the children woke early, as children do on Christmas, regardless of the era or their circumstances. There were small gifts waiting for them, nothing expensive or elaborate, just practical items that the family could afford. A pocket knife for Arthur, hair ribbons for the girls, small toys for the younger boys. Perhaps a piece of candy for each child, a rare treat in a household where sugar was expensive and carefully rationed. These weren't extravagant presents, but they were given with love, and the children received them with the pure joy that comes from not knowing any better, from not yet understanding that some families had more while others had so much less. Fannie made breakfast for the family, working in the small kitchen that had been the center of her domestic life for so many years. She made biscuits from scratch, mixing flour, lard, and milk into dough that she rolled out on a floured board. She made gravy from pan drippings and milk, thick and filling. She fried salt pork until it was crispy. It was a simple meal, the kind of plain but substantial country breakfast that could stretch to feed 9 mouths without breaking the limited family budget. The family gathered around the table, Charlie at the head, Fannie serving, the children in their usual spots, determined by age and preference. They ate together, maybe talking about the day ahead, about Christmas dinner later, about playing in the cold outside. It was a normal family breakfast. From the outside, looking in through the frost-covered windows, you would have seen nothing unusual, just a farming family on Christmas morning, sharing a meal, together. After breakfast, the children helped clear the table. Marie and Carrie washed the dishes while their mother directed them. Arthur was restless, as 16-year-old boys often are, eager to be doing something physical rather than sitting around the house. Charlie, noticing this, told Arthur to go out to the woods behind the property and cut down some branches for kindling. They needed more firewood to keep the house warm through the coming winter nights, and this was a job Arthur could handle alone. Arthur grabbed an axe from the shed, pulled on his coat, and headed out into the cold morning. He was glad for the excuse to be outside, to be moving, to be away from the strange tension that had been building in the house over the past few days. As he walked into the woods, swinging the axe, breathing the cold air, Arthur had no idea that his father had just sent him away deliberately. That Charlie wanted him gone for what came next. That Arthur was being spared not out of love, but out of practicality. He was the oldest boy, the strongest, the one who might fight back. So Charlie removed him from the equation with a simple errand that would take at least an hour to complete. Once Arthur was safely away, far enough that he wouldn't hear gunshots immediately or be able to return quickly, Charlie made his move. He went to the barn where he kept his shotgun, a weapon he'd owned for years and used for hunting rabbits and squirrels to supplement the family's diet. He loaded the gun carefully, mechanically, his hands steady. He also picked up a wooden club, a heavy piece of timber that farmers used for various purposes, breaking up clods of earth, driving stakes, stunning hogs before slaughter. Then, armed with a shotgun and a club, Charlie Lawson walked back toward his house. His wife was likely in the barn, sorting tobacco. His daughters were probably in the house, still cleaning up from breakfast, or playing with their Christmas gifts. His younger sons were certainly nearby, playing in the dirt yard or exploring around the outbuildings the way small boys do. And Charlie Lawson, holding instruments of death in his hands, began systematically murdering his family. The massacre took approximately 30 minutes from first shot to last. 30 minutes to end 7 lives. 30 minutes to destroy a family. 30 minutes to transform a Christmas morning into a nightmare that would echo through generations. Fannie was in the tobacco barn when Charlie found her. The barn was a separate structure from the house, used for storing and sorting the dried tobacco leaves that were the family's primary source of income. Fannie was doing normal farm wife work, the kind of thing she did almost every day, examining the tobacco, sorting it by quality, preparing it to be taken to market where it would be sold and turned into cigarettes or chewing tobacco. The barn was dim, lit only by what sunlight filtered through gaps in the wooden walls. It smelled of earth and dried plants and the particular musty sweetness of cured tobacco. Fannie probably heard footsteps approaching, probably looked up from her work, probably saw her husband entering the barn carrying his shotgun. Maybe she thought he was going hunting, even though it was Christmas. Maybe she started to ask him where he was going, whether he'd be back for dinner, whether he needed anything. We'll never know what Fannie's last words were or what expression crossed her face when she realized what was about to happen. Charlie raised the shotgun and fired. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space of the barn. The shot hit Fannie square in the chest, the force of it throwing her backward onto the pile of tobacco leaves she'd been sorting. She died almost instantly, her heart torn apart by the shotgun pellets, her blood soaking into the dried plants she'd spent so many hours tending. Charlie didn't pause, didn't check if she was dead, didn't kneel beside the body of the woman he'd married nearly 2 decades ago. The woman who'd given him 7 children, the woman who'd worked beside him through good harvests and bad, through lean years and slightly less lean years. He simply turned and walked back out of the barn, the shotgun still smoking in his hands, and headed toward the house where his daughters were going about their Christmas morning activities, completely unaware that their mother was already dead. Marie was 17 years old, on the cusp of womanhood, beautiful in that fresh-faced country way that photographers and painters have always loved. She had dark hair that fell past her shoulders, her mother's high cheekbones, and eyes that suggested intelligence and curiosity beyond the limited opportunities available to a farmer's daughter in rural North Carolina. She'd attended school through 8th grade, which was more education than many girls her age received. She could read and write well. She helped her mother with the younger children and with household tasks. She was, by all accounts, a good daughter, responsible and caring. Some people who knew the family said Marie had dreams of leaving Germanton someday, of going to a city and finding work as a secretary or in a store. But those dreams would never materialize because on Christmas morning 1929, her father decided she needed to die. The exact circumstances of Marie's death are disputed in the various accounts of the massacre. Some reports say she was in the house when Charlie came for her. Others suggest she was walking between the barn and the house, perhaps sent by her siblings to check on their mother who hadn't returned. What we know for certain, based on the medical examiner's report and the physical evidence found at the scene, is that Marie was shot in the back of the head. The bullet entered at the base of her skull and traveled upward through her brain, killing her instantly. The trajectory of the shot and the location of her body indicate that Marie had been running when her father pulled the trigger. She'd seen something, perhaps her mother's body in the barn, perhaps the look in her father's eyes, and she tried to escape. She turned and run, her heart pounding, terror flooding her system, her mind unable to process what was happening. But you can't outrun a bullet, especially not when your own father is the one pulling the trigger, especially not when he's standing close enough that missing would be almost impossible. Marie fell face down in the cold dirt between the barn and the house. 17 years of life extinguished in an instant. Her new dress, the one Charlie had bought just days ago, the one she'd worn for the family photograph, was splattered with blood and brain matter. Charlie stood over his daughter's body for a moment. Then he did something that still disturbs me more than almost anything else about this case. He grabbed Marie by her arms and dragged her corpse back into the tobacco barn. He positioned her body next to her mother's, arranging her carefully, crossing her arms over her chest. He took off his jacket and placed it under her head like a pillow, as if he wanted her to be comfortable in death. This careful arrangement of the bodies wasn't the action of a man in a blind, uncontrollable rage. This was methodical, deliberate, purposeful. Charlie was staging a scene, creating a specific tableau, and he wasn't finished. He still had 5 more children to kill. Charlie walked back to the house. By now, the other children must have heard the gunshots. In the quiet of a rural Christmas morning, the blast from a shotgun would have carried clearly. The younger children were probably frightened, crying, calling for their mother. Carrie, who was 12, might have been trying to comfort them, not understanding what the sounds meant but feeling the rise in panic in her chest. Charlie entered the house and found Carrie first. Investigators later determined that he beat her to death with a wooden club, striking her repeatedly in the head and body until she stopped moving. Why didn't Charlie shoot Carrie like he'd shot her mother and older sister? We don't know. Perhaps he was conserving ammunition. Perhaps the close confines of the house made a shotgun impractical. Or perhaps there was some twisted logic in his mind that dictated which weapon to use on which child. 12-year-old Carrie died in agony, her skull fractured by multiple blows from her father's club, her young body unable to withstand the brutal assault. Then Charlie moved through the house, hunting his other children like an animal pursuing prey. He found 4-year-old James cowering in a corner and shot him. The little boy who'd been playing with his Christmas toys just an hour earlier died with a shotgun blast to his small body. 2-year-old Raymond was next. Charlie beat him to death with the club, the same weapon he'd used on Carrie. A toddler who could barely speak full sentences, whose entire life had been lived in the loving arms of his parents and siblings, was murdered by his own father with savage brutality. I have to pause here, even in the telling, because the weight of these deaths is almost unbearable. These weren't soldiers or criminals, or people who'd lived full lives. These were babies, children whose futures were infinite possibility. And Charlie Lawson looked into their faces that resembled his own, faces that carried his genetic legacy, and he killed them without mercy. 7-year-old Maybell tried to hide. She was old enough to understand that something terrible was happening, young enough to believe that hiding might save her. Investigators found her body under a bed, pulled out from her hiding place and shot. She'd tried to make herself small, tried to be invisible, tried to do what children instinctively do when faced with overwhelming danger. But there was no safety in that house, no hiding place secure enough, no childhood innocence strong enough to stop what was happening. Charlie found her and killed her, adding another small corpse to the growing collection of his murdered children. And then there was Mary Lou, the baby, 4 months old. She couldn't walk or talk or even fully understand the world around her. She was an infant, completely helpless, absolutely dependent on her parents for survival. She was lying in her cradle, or perhaps being held by one of her older siblings. And Charlie Lawson, father of 8 children, husband to Fannie for nearly 2 decades, shot his infant daughter. He pointed a gun at a 4-month-old baby and pulled the trigger, ending a life that had barely begun. After murdering 6 of his children and his wife, Charlie did something that continues to disturb researchers and investigators to this day. He didn't just leave the bodies where they'd fallen. He moved them, he arranged them, he positioned them with care and attention to detail. In the tobacco barn, he'd already placed Fannie and Marie side by side. Now he carried the younger children's bodies and arranged them carefully. He placed small pillows and pieces of cloth under their heads. He crossed their arms over their chests in the traditional repose of death. He positioned them so they looked peaceful, comfortable, at rest. Some accounts say he even closed their eyes, though with the trauma inflicted on their bodies, this would have been difficult. This staging of the bodies is what transforms the Lawson Massacre from a family annihilation into something even more disturbing. This wasn't a crime of passion where a man loses control and kills in a moment of rage. This was calculated, premeditated. The act of arranging the bodies shows that Charlie had time to think between murders, that he maintained enough composure and presence of mind to care about how his victims looked after death. Some people interpret this careful arrangement as evidence of remorse, as a father's final attempt to show love to the children he'd murdered. They suggest that Charlie regretted what he'd done even as he was doing it, that the positioning of bodies was his way of apologizing or trying to give them dignity in death. I interpret it differently, and my interpretation makes my skin crawl every time I think about it. I believe Charlie was proud of what he'd done. I believe he was creating a display, arranging his victims like a hunter arranges trophies, like an artist arranges a still life. The care he took in positioning the bodies suggests someone who wanted the scene to look a certain way, who had a vision for how his massacre should appear when discovered. This wasn't love. This was control taken to its ultimate extreme. Charlie Lawson had controlled his family in life, and now he was controlling them in death, determining not just how they would die but how they would be found. With 7 members of his family dead, his wife, and 6 of his 8 children, Charlie Lawson walked out of the farmhouse and headed into the woods behind the property. He was still carrying his shotgun. His clothes were spattered with blood from his victims. His hands had beaten children to death and pulled triggers and arranged corpses. He walked into the forest, away from the house that had been his home, away from the bodies of the people who had been his family. He walked until he found a spot he apparently deemed appropriate, a place near some rocks and trees, a location that would have been familiar to him from years of working this land. And there, sitting down among the fallen leaves and winter underbrush, Charlie Lawson placed the barrel of his shotgun against his chest, reached down to the trigger, and fired one final shot. The blast killed him instantly, tearing through his chest and heart, ending the life of a man who'd spent his final hours transforming himself into a monster. Charlie's body was found several hours later by searchers from town, partially covered by snow that had begun falling that Christmas afternoon. His eyes were open, staring at the winter sky. His finger was still near the trigger of the shotgun. Blood had pooled around his body, soaking into the frozen ground. He'd left no note, no explanation, no final words. Whatever had driven him to commit such horror, whatever thoughts had filled his mind as he murdered his wife and children, died with him in those woods. And that silence, that absence of explanation, would haunt the investigation and torment the community for decades to come. Arthur Lawson, the sole surviving child, discovered the beginning of the massacre when he returned from his errand in the woods. He'd been gone perhaps an hour, maybe slightly more. He'd cut branches for kindling, bundled them, and carried them back toward the house, probably thinking about Christmas dinner, about playing with his siblings, about the normal rhythms of a holiday on a farm. As Arthur approached the house, he immediately sensed something was wrong. The usual sounds were absent: no children playing, no mother calling, no normal farm noises. The silence was profound and unnatural. Arthur dropped his bundle of kindling and started calling for his family. No one answered. He checked the house first, moving from room to room, and there he found the bodies of his younger siblings. I cannot imagine what that moment was like for a 16-year-old boy. The shock, the horror, the inability to process what his eyes were seeing. His little brothers and sisters, whom he'd eaten breakfast with just hours ago, were now corpses arranged like dolls in a grotesque display. Arthur ran from the house, screaming, his mind fragmenting under the weight of what he'd witnessed. He ran to the barn, perhaps thinking his mother could explain, could make sense of this nightmare. Instead, he found Fannie and Marie dead among the tobacco leaves. Arthur Lawson ran from the property. He ran stumbling and screaming down the dirt road, toward the nearest neighbor's house, half a mile away. He was crying, hyperventilating, barely able to form coherent words. When he reached the neighbor's house and pounded on the door, the family inside initially thought he'd been injured, that there'd been some kind of accident on the farm. But as Arthur gasped out his story that his family was dead, that everyone was dead, that blood was everywhere, the neighbors realized something unthinkable had occurred. Word spread through Germanton with shocking speed. In a small rural community where everyone knew everyone, where gossip traveled faster than automobiles, the news that something terrible had happened at the Lawson farm reached the sheriff's office within an hour. By early afternoon on Christmas Day, law enforcement and curious neighbors were descending on the property, unprepared for the scene they would encounter. The investigation began immediately. Though calling it an investigation might be generous given the limitations of rural law enforcement in 1929, the local sheriff and coroner examined the scene, documented what they found with the tools available to them, and began the grim task of trying to understand what had happened and why. They counted the bodies, 7 victims inside and around the house and barn, 1 perpetrator dead in the woods. They noted the careful arrangement of the corpses, the mixing of shooting and beating as methods of murder, the evidence of planning in the new clothes and recent photographs. They interviewed Arthur extensively, though the traumatized teenager could provide little useful information beyond the timeline of his departure and return. They spoke to neighbors, asking when anyone had last seen the Lawson family alive, whether they'd noticed anything unusual in Charlie's behavior or demeanor. Everyone said essentially the same thing. Charlie had been acting strangely lately. He'd been withdrawn, irritable, distant. The purchase of new clothes and the professional photographs had struck neighbors as odd, given the family's financial situation, but nobody had suspected violence. Nobody had imagined Charlie capable of murder. He'd been known as a hard worker, a stern father, a man who kept to himself but was generally considered respectable and normal. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming for the community. How could Charlie Lawson, farmer and father, become Charlie Lawson, family and a leader? What could possibly drive a man to such extremes? The sheriff searched the farmhouse thoroughly, looking for a suicide note, a letter, any written explanation Charlie might have left behind. He found nothing. No diary, no confession, no explanation. Charlie had communicated his intentions through actions, not words, and those actions left nothing but questions and corpses. The community response to the massacre was immediate and visceral. Germanton was a small town where everyone knew the Lawson family, where Fannie had friends and Charlie had business relationships and the children had playmates and classmates. The massacre didn't just destroy one family, it traumatized an entire community. Churches held special services. Neighbors brought food and supplies to Arthur, who was being cared for by relatives. People struggled to reconcile their memories of the Lawsons with the horror of what had happened. How could the family they'd seen at church just weeks ago, the children they'd watched grow up, end up murdered on Christmas Day? The psychological impact on the community was profound and lasting. Parents held their children closer. Husbands and wives looked at each other with new uncertainty. If Charlie Lawson could do this, what did that say about the darkness potentially lurking in any man's heart? The funeral was held on December 28th, just 3 days after the massacre. 8 coffins were lined up at the front of the local church, 7 victims and their murderer. The decision to bury Charlie with his family was controversial. Some people in the community believed he should be denied Christian burial, that he should be buried separately as a mark of shame and punishment. But Fannie's relatives, who had the authority to make such decisions, insisted that despite what Charlie had done in his final hours, he'd once been their son-in-law, the father of their grandchildren and nieces and nephews. They couldn't separate the man from the monster, couldn't reconcile the 2 versions of Charlie Lawson that existed in their minds. So they allowed him to be buried in the same cemetery as his victims, though some distance away, a compromise between mercy and justice that satisfied no one completely. The funeral was massive, far larger than anything Germanton had ever seen. The small church couldn't begin to hold all the people who came. Thousands of people attended, traveling from all over North Carolina and even from neighboring states. Some came out of genuine grief and respect for the victims. Others came out of morbid curiosity, drawn by the sensational nature of the crime, eager to see the coffins and hear the details and experience the macabre thrill of proximity to tragedy. The crowd was so large that most people had to stand outside the church, straining to hear the service through open windows. The sight of 8 coffins at the front of the church, including the tiny casket that held foreman-hold Mary Lou, barely larger than a shoebox, broke even the hardest hearts. The preacher spoke about forgiveness and God's mysterious ways, but his words fell hollow against the magnitude of what had occurred. How do you find meaning in the murder of babies? How do you forgive the unforgivable? After the funeral, after the bodies were buried in the red North Carolina earth, The real work of processing and understanding began. The community needed answers. They needed reasons. They needed to make sense of something that defied sense. And so the rumors began, spreading through Germanton and beyond, each theory attempting to explain the inexplicable. The most persistent and disturbing theory involved Marie, the 17-year-old daughter. People began whispering that Charlie had been having an incestuous relationship with her, that Marie was pregnant with her father's child, that Charlie killed the family to hide his shame and prevent his crime from being discovered. This theory gained traction quickly because it provided a motive that people could understand, even if they found it repulsive. Incest and illegitimate pregnancy were shameful secrets that had driven desperate acts throughout history. If true, it explained the timing. Mary was at an age where a pregnancy would soon become visible, where hiding it would become impossible. The incest theory also explained the new clothes and the photograph. Charlie's attempt to create one final family memory, a last portrait before he destroyed them all. It explained why he arranged the bodies so carefully, perhaps a twisted expression of the love he claimed to feel for Marie, for all of them. It explained the murders themselves. If Charlie was going to kill Marie, to silence her, he couldn't leave witnesses. Fannie might have known about the abuse. The other children might have suspected something. Arthur, being sent away, was deliberately spared because he was Charlie's true son, not involved in the shameful secret. The theory was never officially proven. Marie's body was never examined for signs of pregnancy or sexual assault. By the time anyone thought to do such an examination, she'd already been buried, and the idea of exhuming her corpse seemed too disrespectful, too traumatic for the surviving relatives. But the rumor persisted and spread, passed down through generations like a dark inheritance. People in Germanton still talk about it today, 95 years later. Tour guides at the Lawson Family Museum repeat the theory as the likely explanation. Books and articles about the case present it as the probable motive. But here's what troubles me about this theory. It's based entirely on speculation and small-town gossip. There's no actual evidence. No witness ever came forward to say they'd seen inappropriate behavior between Charlie and Marie. No diary or letter was ever found suggesting such a relationship. The pregnancy was never confirmed. The entire theory rests on nothing more substantial than whispers and assumptions. It's possible the incest theory is true. It's also possible it's completely false, a story the community invented because they needed some explanation, any explanation, for the inexplicable. Sometimes people would rather believe the worst about someone than accept that evil can emerge without clear cause. Another theory focused on money and the economic catastrophe of 1929. The stock market had crashed on Black Tuesday, October 29th, just 2 months before the massacre. Banks were failing across America. Businesses were closing. Farms were being foreclosed. The Great Depression was beginning, though nobody realized yet how bad things would get or how long the suffering would last. Maybe Charlie was drowning in debt. Maybe he owed money to people who were threatening him. Maybe he'd made bad financial decisions, lost the farm, and couldn't bear to see his family suffer through poverty and eviction. This theory had some factual basis. Charlie had indeed been struggling financially. Tobacco prices were falling. The family lived simply, close to the edge of survival, even in good times. The purchase of new clothes and professional photographs was financially irresponsible, a luxury they couldn't afford. Perhaps that spending was part of Charlie's plan, a final gift to his family before he ended their lives and his own. Suicide murder, driven by financial desperation, was not uncommon during the Great Depression. As the economy collapsed through the 1930s, stories emerged with grim regularity of fathers who killed their families and themselves rather than face homelessness and starvation. These men, and they were almost always men, saw themselves as providers and protectors. When they could no longer provide, when they faced the humiliation of poverty and failure, some chose death over dishonor. In their twisted logic, killing their families was merciful, sparing them from suffering. But this theory has problems when applied to Charlie Lawson. First, the brutality of the murders doesn't fit a mercy killing. A man trying to spare his family from suffering might use poison or carbon monoxide, something relatively quick and painless. Charlie used a shotgun and a club. He made them suffer. Second, the careful staging of bodies suggests pride rather than remorse. And third, while money was tight, the Lawsons weren't facing immediate eviction or starvation. They had food, shelter, and their tobacco crop. Charlie's financial situation was difficult but not catastrophically hopeless. A third theory suggested mental illness. Perhaps Charlie had developed a brain tumor that affected his behavior and judgment. Perhaps he suffered from undiagnosed schizophrenia or another psychiatric condition that caused delusions or psychosis. His strange behavior in the weeks before Christmas, the inexplicable spending, the insistence on photographs, the distant stare could have been symptoms of neurological disease or psychiatric breakdown. This theory has the advantage of not requiring Charlie to be purely evil. It allows for the possibility that he was sick, that something biological went wrong in his brain, that the massacre was the result of disease rather than deliberate choice. Mental illness is comforting as an explanation because it creates distance between ordinary people and murderers. If Charlie had a brain tumor, then we're safe. We don't have brain tumors, so we'd never do what he did. But this theory also feels like an excuse, a way to avoid confronting the darker truth about human nature. We want mental illness to explain evil because the alternative is terrifying. That ordinary people are capable of extraordinary horror. That the line between normal and monstrous is thinner than we want to believe. That given the right combination of stress and circumstance and internal darkness, any of us might be capable of unthinkable acts. Charlie Lawson was never diagnosed with mental illness during his life. No doctor ever treated him for psychiatric symptoms. His behavior, while strange in his final weeks, wasn't so bizarre that anyone suggested he needed medical intervention. He functioned normally in daily life right up until Christmas morning. If Charlie was insane, his insanity was highly specific and controlled, manifesting only in his decision to murder his family while leaving him capable of methodical planning and execution. The Lawson farmhouse became a tourist attraction almost immediately after the murders. This wasn't unusual for the Americans, have always been fascinated by murder sites and true crime, and in the days before internet and television, actually visiting the location of a famous crime was one of the few ways to connect with the story. Within weeks of the massacre, curious people were driving out to Germanton to see where it happened. They'd park their cars along the road and walk through the property, peering through windows, taking photographs, collecting souvenirs from the yard rocks, pieces of wood, anything they could claim came from the murder site. The property owners tried to discourage this ghoulish tourism, but it was impossible to stop. The Lawson Massacre was the most sensational crime North Carolina had ever seen, and people were drawn to it like moths to a flame. The farmhouse itself quickly developed a reputation for being haunted. Visitors reported strange experiences that they attributed to the spirits of the murdered family. They claimed to hear children's laughter coming from empty rooms, the sound of little feet running across wooden floors when nobody was there. They reported seeing figures moving past windows, a woman in the kitchen, children playing in the yard that vanished when approached. They felt sudden cold spots in certain rooms, particularly where bodies had been found. They smelled tobacco smoke and gunpowder when there was no possible source for those scents. Some visitors reported feeling overwhelming sadness or dread, emotional responses so strong they had to leave the property immediately. Skeptics dismissed these accounts as imagination and suggestion, people seeing what they expected to see because they knew the building's history. But the reports were consistent and came from multiple independent witnesses over many decades. The property changed hands multiple times over the years, with each owner reporting paranormal activity. Some embraced the house's dark history and tried to profit from it. In the 1950s, one owner briefly turned the farmhouse into a roadside attraction, charging admission for tours of the murder scene. Visitors could walk through the rooms where children died, stand in the barn where Fannie and Marie were found, see the places where evil had manifested on Christmas morning 1929. The venture failed relatively quickly. Apparently, even curiosity seekers found the atmosphere too oppressive, too heavy with suffering and death. People who paid to tour the house left feeling disturbed and sick rather than entertained. The owner eventually closed the attraction and sold the property, unable to make a profit from murder and unable to live comfortably in a house soaked in tragedy. I visited the site myself 3 years ago, driven by the same compulsion that draws me to all the places I research. The original farmhouse is gone now, torn down decades ago because it had fallen into disrepair and because no one wanted to live in a place with such horrific history. But the land is still there, and the tobacco barn where Fannie and Marie died is still standing, weathered gray and sagging but recognizable from old photographs. I walked the property alone on a gray November afternoon. trying to feel some connection to what happened there, trying to understand the space where a family died. I stood where the house had been, its location marked now only by an old foundation and some scattered bricks. I walked to the barn and stood in the doorway, imagining Fannie sorting tobacco, imagining Charlie raising his shotgun. I went into the woods where Charlie killed himself, following descriptions of the location until I found what I thought was the right spot. And I'll be honest with you, I felt nothing supernatural. No ghosts, no cold spots, no mysterious voices or apparitions. What I felt was sadness, deep, overwhelming sadness that seemed to emanate from the land itself. Not the theatrical sadness of ghost stories, but something more profound and real, the weight of grief that soaks into earth and doesn't wash away no matter how much time passes. Standing there, I thought about Fannie's last moments, about whether she had time to understand what was happening before the shotgun blast ended her life. I thought about Marie running, terror flooding her 17-year-old mind, unable to comprehend why her father was chasing her with murder in his eyes. I thought about the younger children, Carrie, Maybell, James, Raymond, baby Mary Lou, whose lives were so brief and whose deaths were so brutal. And I thought about Arthur, returning from his innocent errand to discover a nightmare that would haunt him forever. Arthur Lawson, the sole survivor, lived with his trauma for the rest of his short life. He was 16 when his father murdered his family, old enough to understand what had happened, young enough to be permanently scarred by it. Arthur moved in with relatives after the massacre. The community rallied around him with food and clothes and sympathy, but nothing could truly help. How do you recover from finding your entire family slaughtered? How do you sleep at night knowing that your father, the man who raised you, was capable of such horror? How do you build a normal life when the foundation of everything you knew has been destroyed in blood and violence? Arthur eventually married and had children of his own. He tried to create a new family, tried to build something positive from the ruins of his past. But according to those who knew him, Arthur never fully recovered from the massacre. He rarely spoke about Christmas Day 1929. When he did discuss it, it was in fragments, brief comments that suggested the memories were too painful to fully articulate. He'd mention finding his siblings' bodies, then stop mid-sentence, unable to continue. He'd talk about his mother, then fall silent, his eyes distant. He carried guilt for surviving, the irrational but powerful belief that he should have been there, should have done something, should have saved them somehow. Survivor's guilt is well documented in trauma survivors, the feeling that you don't deserve to be alive when others died, the constant questioning of why you were spared when others weren't. Arthur's guilt was amplified by the knowledge that his father had deliberately sent him away. Charlie had wanted Arthur to survive. Arthur had been chosen for life while his mother and siblings were chosen for death. That knowledge must have been unbearable. Arthur Lawson died in 1945, just 16 years after the massacre. He was only 32 years old. The official cause of death was listed as complications from a car accident. But I've often wondered about the circumstances. Was it truly an accident, or did Arthur, consciously or subconsciously, seek death as an escape from the unbearable weight of his memories? Did he spend those 16 years slowly dying inside, gradually crushed by grief and guilt and trauma, until his body simply gave out? We'll never know. What we do know is that Arthur never escaped the shadow of Christmas 1929. The massacre didn't just kill 7 people, it destroyed 8 lives, with Arthur's death being simply slower than the others. The photograph taken just 3 days before the massacre survived and became infamous. Copies circulated through Germanton and across North Carolina and eventually across America. For years it was actually sold as a postcard, a macabre souvenir of America's most notorious family murder. You could buy a copy at gas stations and tourist shops, take it home, put it in a scrapbook alongside postcards from national parks and beach resorts. The commercialization of tragedy wasn't unusual in the early 20th century. American murder and disaster were entertainment, commodified and consumed without the ethical concerns that would later develop. Looking at that photograph now, knowing what I know about what happened 3 days after it was taken, transforms it into something unbearable. Those children staring at the camera weren't just posing for a portrait. They were, unknowingly, creating their memorial image, the picture that would be reprinted in newspapers and books for nearly a century. Charlie knew what that photograph was. When he arranged his family in their new clothes, when he positioned them carefully for the photographer, when he paid good money for professional images, He knew these would be the last pictures of them alive. That's what makes the photograph so disturbing to me. It's not just a picture. It's evidence of premeditation. It's proof that Charlie was planning their deaths days in advance, that he was thinking about how to memorialize them before he murdered them. The photograph is Charlie's legacy, his statement to the world. Look at my family. Look at what I created. Look at what I'm about to destroy. Every time I examine that image, and I've spent hours studying it, analyzing every face and expression, I tried to see some hint of what was coming. Some shadow in Charlie's eyes, some tension in the children's postures, some warning that tragedy was approaching. But there's nothing, just a farm family in their Sunday best, staring at a camera in 1929. Over the decades since the massacre, the Lawson case has inspired an enormous amount of cultural output. Songs were written about the murders, including a ballad that became popular in the Appalachian region and was recorded by various folk and country artists. Books were published, some purporting to solve the mystery, others simply retelling the story for new generations. Documentaries were produced, featuring interviews with people who'd known the family or investigated the crime. In Madison, North Carolina, about 30 miles from where the murders occurred, a small museum dedicated to the case opened in the 1990s. The museum houses artifacts from the Lawson family, items that survived the decades through various collections and estate sales. I've visited the Lawson Family Museum twice, and each visit left me with mixed feelings. On one hand, the museum preserves history and keeps the victim's memory alive. The exhibits include clothing worn in the famous photograph, items from the farmhouse, newspaper clippings from the investigation, and Arthur's handwritten account of discovering the bodies. These artifacts make the massacre feel real in a way that reading about it cannot. Seeing Marie's dress behind glass, looking at baby Mary Lou's tiny cradle, reading the actual words Arthur wrote, describing the worst day of his life, these experiences create a direct connection to the tragedy that's both powerful and deeply unsettling. On the other hand, there's something uncomfortable about the museum's existence. Is it disrespectful to profit from tragedy, even modestly? Is it appropriate to turn a murder site into a tourist destination? These are difficult questions without easy answers. The museum's curator once told me that they see their mission as honoring the victims by ensuring their story isn't forgotten. They argue that the Lawson Massacre is an important part of North Carolina history, a tragedy that shaped the region and deserves to be remembered. They point out that the museum treats the subject with respect, avoiding sensationalism and focusing on the human cost of the violence. I understand their perspective and even agree with it to some extent. But I also can't shake the discomfort I feel walking through exhibits of dead people's belongings, reading about their murders, studying photographs of children who died brutally. There's a fine line between honoring victims and exploiting them, and sometimes I'm not sure which side of that line we're on when we consume true crime content, whether in museum form or in videos like the one you're watching now. The question I keep returning to after years of researching this case is fundamental and troubling. Was Charlie Lawson evil, or was he broken? This might seem like a distinction without a difference. The results were the same regardless of Charlie's internal state, but I think the question matters because it speaks to how we understand human nature and violence. If Charlie was evil, if he was simply a bad person who chose to do terrible things, then we can maintain our comfortable belief that people sort neatly into categories of good and bad, and that good people like us would never do such things. But if Charlie was broken, if something inside him fractured under stress or illness or circumstance, then the boundaries become blurrier and more frightening. If Charlie started as an ordinary person and became a monster, then any of us might harbor similar potential under the right conditions. I've read every account I could find. I've interviewed descendants of people who knew the Lawson family. I've studied dozens of similar cases of family annihilation, looking for patterns that might explain what happened on Christmas morning 1929, and I still don't have a definitive answer. Maybe Charlie was sexually abusing Marie. Maybe the shame and terror of exposure drove him to murder his entire family to hide his crime. This theory has the advantage of providing a motive that, while repulsive, is comprehensible. It explains the timing and the totality of the violence, but it's based on rumor and speculation rather than evidence. Maybe Charlie was mentally ill, suffering from delusions or a brain tumor or psychiatric disease that destroyed his judgment and empathy. This theory provides comfort because it suggests disease rather than choice, illness rather than evil. But Charlie showed no clear signs of psychosis or neurological problems, and his planning and execution of the murders showed disturbing clarity of thought. Maybe financial stress and the weight of the Great Depression crushed Charlie's spirit until violence seemed like the only solution to problems he couldn't solve. Economic desperation drove many men to terrible acts during the 1930s, and Charlie was certainly struggling financially. But murder-suicide typically looks different from what Charlie did: quicker, less brutal, more clearly aimed at ending suffering rather than causing it. Or maybe, and this is the possibility that keeps me awake at night, maybe there was no grand reason. Maybe Charlie simply decided one day that he wanted his family dead, and so he killed them. Maybe evil doesn't need elaborate justification or underlying cause. Maybe sometimes people do monstrous things for reasons that are banal or incomprehensible or non-existent. This is the most terrifying possibility because it offers no protection, no way to identify potential monsters before they act, no clear lesson to learn that might prevent future tragedies. The Lawson Massacre challenges our fundamental assumptions about human nature. We desperately want to believe that people who commit terrible acts are fundamentally different from us. We call them monsters, psychopaths, evil labels that create distance and difference, that reassure us that we're safe because we're not like them. It's comforting to think that way because it means we can identify the dangerous people and avoid them. That evil announces itself clearly enough for good people to recognize and reject it. But Charlie Lawson wasn't a monster from birth. He wasn't born twisted or broken or wrong. He was, by all accounts from people who knew him before Christmas 1929, an ordinary man, a farmer, a husband, a father. He'd held his babies when they were born, felt the joy of new life entering the world. He'd taught his sons to work the land, passing on knowledge and skills. He'd walked his daughters to church on Sundays, participated in the community, lived what appeared to be a normal life. And then, on Christmas Day, he murdered 7 members of his family in an act of violence so extreme and brutal that it shocked even hardened law enforcement. If Charlie could transform from father to killer, if the boundary between normal and monstrous proved so permeable for him, then what does that say about the rest of us? That's the real horror of the Lawson Massacre, not the blood or the bodies, or even the calculated cruelty of how it was done. The horror is the realization that evil can emerge from the most ordinary places, that monsters can be made from men, that the capacity for terrible violence might lie dormant in people who seem completely normal, until the day it doesn't. I think about Arthur Lawson often when I can't sleep, which happens more than I'd like after spending years researching cases like this. I think about what it must have been like to be 16 years old, to be sent on a simple errand by your father, to return home expecting Christmas dinner and family and normalcy. Instead, Arthur walked into hell. He found his little brothers and sisters dead, arranged like dolls. He found his mother and oldest sister in a tobacco barn, their blood soaking into dried plants. He found his father's body in the woods, a suicide that came too late to undo the horror that preceded it. What does that moment do to a person? How does a 16-year-old mind process the impossible truth that his father murdered his family? Did Arthur wonder if he could have stopped it? Did he lie awake at night imagining different scenarios, coming home earlier, fighting his father, saving his mother and siblings? Did Arthur hate Charlie for what he'd done? Or did some part of him still love the man who'd raised him, unable to reconcile the father he remembered with the monster who pulled the trigger? Arthur took those answers with him when he died at 32, but I imagine him carrying an unbearable weight every day of those 16 years he survived. Survivor's guilt amplified by the knowledge that his father deliberately sent him away. That Charlie wanted Arthur to live while everyone else died. That selection, that choosing, must have been almost as traumatic as the murders themselves. Why was Arthur spared? Was it love? Was it that Charlie needed one person to remain, to find the bodies, to tell the story? Was Arthur left alive to bear witness to Charlie's final act, to carry the weight of this tragedy forward into the world? The new clothes haunt me in a way that's hard to articulate. Charlie spent money the family didn't have money that should have gone to keeping the farm running, to feeding his children, to surviving the approaching depression, to buy new outfits for everyone. He dressed his family up like they were going to a wedding or a fancy church service, and then, just days later, he murdered them while they were wearing those new clothes, or with those clothes hanging in their closets, waiting for the next special occasion that would never come. Some people interpret this as a twisted form of respect, Charlie's way of honoring his family before ending their lives, ensuring they looked their best for the final photograph, And for whatever came after death, I see it completely differently, and my interpretation makes my skin crawl every time I think about it. I think the new clothes were about control. Charlie was staging an event, directing a performance, and he wanted his actors to be dressed appropriately for the roles he'd assigned them. The photograph, the clothes, the careful arrangement of bodies after the murders, these weren't acts of love or respect. They were the actions of someone who wanted absolute control over every aspect of what was about to happen. Charlie Lawson didn't just want to kill his family. He wanted to orchestrate their deaths precisely, with everything arranged exactly as he envisioned it. The new clothes were costumes. The photograph was a program. The arranged bodies were the final tableau. Charlie was directing a play where he controlled everything: the staging, the costumes, the performance, and the finale. This level of control and planning speaks to something deeply disturbing in Charlie's psychology, something that goes beyond rage or desperation into territory that's much darker and more calculated. Christmas in Germanton has never been the same after 1929. Even now, 95 years later, people in the area remember the Lawson Massacre. It's become part of the region's dark folklore, a story that parents tell their children, a legend that shapes how people think about their community's history. Every December, articles appear in local newspapers retelling the story. Every Christmas, someone visits the gravesite where the Lawson family is buried together, leaving fresh flowers on graves that have weathered nearly a century of North Carolina seasons. The massacre has become bigger than the actual historical events. It's become a symbol of shattered innocence, of the darkness that can hide behind ordinary facades, of questions that will never be answered, no matter how desperately we seek closure and understanding. The Lawson Massacre reminds us that home isn't always a sanctuary, that family isn't always protection, that the people who are supposed to love us most can sometimes pose the greatest danger. We like to believe that we're safe in our homes, protected by our families, secure in the knowledge that those who love us would die before harming us. Charlie Lawson shattered that illusion. He showed that fathers can murder sons, that husbands can kill wives, that the dining table where a family shares breakfast can be just hours away from becoming a crime scene. This violation of the fundamental trust that should exist within families is what makes the Lawson Massacre so particularly disturbing. We can understand, in some intellectual way, that strangers might hurt us. Random violence from unknown threats is frightening but comprehensible. But violence from within the family unit itself, from the person whose job is to protect and provide, that strikes at something primal and essential in how we understand human relationships. So why am I telling you this story in such exhaustive detail? Why spend 10,000 words recounting a 95-year-old tragedy, going through every terrible moment, every dead body, every unanswered question? Because the Lawson Massacre matters. It matters because it happened. Because 7 innocent people died violently on a day that should have been filled with love and joy and celebration. It matters because Arthur Lawson spent the rest of his short life haunted by what he witnessed, carrying trauma that eventually helped kill him at 32. It matters because the questions Charlie left behind still echo through the decades, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. And it matters because, if we're brutally honest with ourselves, the story terrifies us for a very personal reason. It reminds us how fragile safety really is. We assume that home is a sanctuary, that family is our greatest protection, that fathers would die before harming their children. We build our entire sense of security on these assumptions. We go to sleep at night trusting that the people who share our homes wish us no harm. The Lawson Massacre shatters those comfortable assumptions like a shotgun blast through a window. It shows us that the greatest danger can come from the people who are supposed to love us most. It demonstrates that ordinary people can transform into monsters, that normal family men can become annihilators, that the line between father and killer can be crossed in a single morning. That's why this story has persisted for 95 years, why it continues to fascinate and horrify, why we can't look away even when we desperately want to. I look at that photograph one final time before I end this. The Lawson family in their new clothes, standing in a line against a photographer's backdrop in Winston-Salem. Charlie on one end, his face stern and distant, his eyes looking at the camera but somehow not seeing it. Fannie on the other end, holding baby Mary Lou, her expression unreadable and neutral in the way of women who've learned to hide their thoughts. The 7 children between them, arranged by height like stairs, ranging from teenage Arthur and Marie down through Carrie and the younger boys, to little Maybell at the end. They look like a normal family. They look like any family you might see at church, or the general store, or walking down a dirt road in rural North Carolina. There's nothing in the photograph that screams his family will be murdered in 3 days. No visible darkness casting shadows. No warning signs clear enough to notice in retrospect. Just ordinary people having their picture taken, dressed in their Sunday best, staring at a camera that's capturing them for posterity. And that's the final lesson of the Lawson Massacre. The truth that keeps me researching these dark corners of human behavior. Evil doesn't announce itself with ominous music and dramatic lighting. It doesn't wear a mask or carry a sign. It doesn't look like our cultural images of monsters and villains. Sometimes evil looks like a father in a new suit, standing with his family, preparing for Christmas. Sometimes it looks like a normal man doing a normal thing, getting a family photograph taken while harboring intentions that are anything but normal. The photograph of the Lawson family is terrifying, not because of what it shows, but because of what it hides. Behind those neutral expressions and new clothes and careful arrangement, Charlie Lawson was planning murder. And nobody looking at that photograph, not the photographer, not the other customers in the studio, not Fannie or the children, suspected a thing. The snow that fell on Christmas Day 1929 covered Charlie Lawson's body in the woods behind the farmhouse. It also covered the blood in the tobacco barn and on the frozen ground around the house. It covered the footprints Charlie made as he walked between victims, the drag marks where he'd moved bodies, the physical evidence of his morning's work. By nightfall on December 25th, the Lawson property looked almost peaceful, blanketed in fresh white snow, the violence hidden beneath nature's attempt to erase human horror. But snow melts. Bloodstains don't wash away completely, not from wood or earth or memory, and some questions never stop asking themselves, no matter how many years pass, no matter how deeply we try to bury them under explanations and theories and comfortable distance. Charlie Lawson murdered his family on Christmas Day, and we still don't know why. Maybe we never will. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the lesson of the Lawson Massacre isn't about finding answers or achieving closure, or finally understanding what drove Charlie to such extremes. Maybe it's about accepting that some horrors exist beyond our ability to explain them, that some acts are too dark for human comprehension, that some questions will echo forever without resolution. Maybe it's about recognizing that evil is real and that it can emerge from the most unexpected places, wearing the most ordinary faces, hiding in the most familiar relationships. And maybe this is what keeps me awake at night. Maybe it's about acknowledging that the capacity for terrible violence doesn't belong only to obvious monsters, that any of us under the right combination of stress and circumstance and internal darkness might be capable of things we cannot currently imagine. That photograph exists still, preserved in museums and books, in countless digital copies. The Lawson family in their new clothes, frozen in time, December 22nd, 1929, unaware that in just 3 days, 6 of the children will be dead, unaware that their mother will be murdered in a tobacco barn, unaware that their father will become their killer. They stare at the camera with expressions that give nothing away, faces that hide all secrets. And Charlie Lawson stands among them, having already decided their fates, counting down the hours until Christmas morning when he'll transform from father into murderer, from protector into destroyer. The photograph is evidence, prophecy, and memorial all at once. It's the last moment before everything changed forever. It's the final image of a family that was about to cease existing. And it's a reminder that sometimes monsters look exactly like ordinary men in new suits, standing with their families, posing for a photograph,